treated too gently for her crimes, to Avienda's mind. The herbs Nynaeve had forced down the woman's throat still fogged her wits, as well as weakening her knees, but Christian held a shield on her with every shred of power she could summon. There was no chance the Shadow Runner might escape. Even had she not been dosed, Christian was as strong in the power as Rihanna, stronger than most Aes Sedai Avienda had met. Yet even Sumiko plucked her skirts nervously and avoided looking at the kneeling woman. "Surely the sisters should have her now," Rihanna's high-pitched voice carried, unsteady enough to belong to the black sister Kirstian shielded. "Nynaeve, said I, we should not be in charge of an Aes Sedai." "That's right," Sumiko put in quickly and anxiously. "The Aes Sedai should have," Sibella echoed her, and nods and murmurs of agreement rippled through the kinswomen. They believed in their bones that they stood far below Aes Sedai. Very likely they would have chosen guarding Trollocs over holding an Aes Sedai. The disapproving stares from Marililla and the other sisters changed once Ispan Shafar's face was revealed. Saritha Tomaris, who had worn her brown-fringed shawl only a few years and still did not have the ageless appearance, glared with a disgust that should have flayed the Shadow Runner at 50 paces. Adelius and Vandine, hands tightening on their skirts, appeared to struggle with hatred for the woman who had been their sister and betrayed them. Yet the stares they gave the knitting circle were not that much better. They, too, knew in their hearts that the kin stood a very long way below them. There was much more to it than that, but the betrayer had been one of their own, and no one but they had the right to her. Avienda agreed. A maiden who betrayed her spear sisters did not die quickly or unshamed. Nynaeve pulled the sack back down over Ispan Shafar's head with some force. "You've done well so far, and you'll continue to do well," she told the kinswomen firmly. "If she shows signs of coming round, pour some more of that mixture down her. It'll keep her giddy as a goat full of ale. Hold her nose if she tries not to swallow. Even an Aes Sedai will swallow if you hold her nose and threaten to box her ears." Rihanna's jaw dropped and her eyes sprang wide, like most of her companions. Sumiko nodded, but slowly, and goggled nearly as much as the others. When kinswomen said Aes Sedai, they might have been naming the Creator. The thought of holding an Aes Sedai's nose, even a Shadow Runner's, painted their faces with horror. By the popping eyes among the Aes Sedai, they liked the notion even less. Marililla opened her mouth, staring at Nynaeve, but just then Elaine reached her, and the Grey sister rounded on her instead, sparing barely a single disapproving frown for Birgitta. It was a measure of her agitation that her voice rose rather than dropping. Normally Marililla was very discreet. "Elaine, you must speak to Nynaeve. Those women are confused and frightened out of their wits already. It won't help if she upsets them even more. If the Amerlin seat really does intend to allow them to go to the tower—" She shook her head slowly, trying to deny that and perhaps a great deal else. "If she does mean to, they must have a clear picture of their places, and the Amerlin does," Elaine cut her off. From Nynaeve, a firm tone was a fist shaken under your nose. From Elaine, it was calm certainty. "They will have their chance to try again, and if they fail, they still will not be sent away. No woman who can channel will be cut off from the tower again. They will all be a part of the White Tower." Fingering her belt knife idly, Avienda wondered about that. Egwene, Elaine's Amerlin seat, said much the same. She was a friend, too, but she had wrapped her heart around being Aes Sedai. Avienda herself did not want to be part of the White Tower. She very much doubted that Soralia or any other wise one did either. Marililla sighed and folded her hands, yet for all her outward acceptance, she still forgot to lower her voice. "As you say, Elaine, but about Ispan, we simply cannot allow—" Elaine raised a hand sharply. Command replaced mere certainty. Cease, Marililla. You have the bowl of the winds to watch. That is enough for anyone. It will be enough for you. Marililla opened her mouth, then closed it again and bowed her head slightly in acquiescence. Under Elaine's steady gaze, the other Aes Sedai bent theirs, too. If some displayed reluctance, however small, not all did. Saritha hurriedly picked up the disc-shaped bundle wrapped in layers of white silk that had been lying by her feet. Her arms barely went all the way around as she held the bowl of the winds to her bosom, smiling anxiously at Elaine, as if to show that she really was keeping a close eye on it. The sea folk women stared hungrily at the bundle, almost leaning forward. Avienda would not have been surprised to see them leap across the stones to seize the bowl. The Aes Sedai saw the same, plainly. Saritha clutched the white parcel more tightly, and Marililla actually stepped between her and the Athaan Nier. Smooth Aes Sedai faces tightened with the effort of remaining expressionless. They believed the bowl should belong to them. All things that used or manipulated the one power belonged to the White Tower in their eyes, no matter who happened to possess them at the moment. But there was the bargain. "The sun moves, Aes Sedai," Renila Din Callan announced loudly, "and danger threatens, so you maintain. If you think to worm free in some fashion by delaying, think twice and again. Try to break the bargain, and by my father's heart I will return to the ships at once, and claim the bowl for redress. It was ours from the breaking." "You watch your tongue with Aes Sedai," Rihanna barked, scandalized indignation from her blue straw hat to the stout shoes peeking from beneath her green and white petticoats. Renila Din Callan's mouth curled into a sneer. "The jellyfish have tongues, it seems. A surprise they can use them, though, when no Aes Sedai gave permission." In an instant, the stable yard was full of shouted insults flying between kin and Athaan Nier, wilder and spineless, and growing worse, strident cries that buried Marililla's attempts to hush Rihanna and her companions on one hand and soothe the sea folk on the other. Several windfinders stopped fingering the daggers thrust behind their sashes and gripped hilts instead. The glow of Saidar sprang up around first one, then another of the brightly clad women. The kinswomen looked startled, though it did not slow their tirade. But Sumiko embraced the source, then Tamarla, then willowy, doe-eyed Chilaris, and soon every one of them and every one of the windfinders shone, while words flew and tempers boiled. Avienda wanted to groan. Any moment blood would begin to flow. She would follow Elaine's lead, but her near sister was glaring cold fury at windfinders and knitting circle alike. Elaine had small patience with stupidity in herself or others, and shouting insults when an enemy might be coming was the worst sort. Avienda took a firm grip on her belt knife, then after a moment embraced Saidar. Life and joy filled her to near weeping. Wise ones only used the power when words had failed, but neither words nor steel would do here. She wished she had some idea of who to kill first. "Enough!" Nynaeve's piercing shriek sliced the words short on every tongue. Astonished faces swiveled toward her. Her head swung dangerously, and she stabbed a finger at the knitting circle. "Stop behaving like children!" Although she had moderated her tone, it was by hairs. "Or do you mean to squabble until the Forsaken come to scoop up the bowl and us? And you," that finger thrust at the Windfinders, "stop trying to wriggle out of your agreement. You won't get the bowl until you've met every last word. Don't you think you will?" Nynaeve swung round on the Aes Sedai. "And you!" Met by cool surprise, her flow of words tapered off into a sour grunt. The Aes Sedai had not joined in the shouting except to try quieting it. None shone with the light of Saidar. That was not enough to calm Nynaeve completely, of course. She tugged fiercely at her hat, plainly still full of anger she wanted to loose. But the kinswomen were staring at the paving stones in red-faced chagrin, and even the windfinders appeared a little abashed. A little, muttering to themselves, yet refusing quite to meet Nynaeve's glare. The glow winked out around one woman after another, until only Avienda still held to the source. She gave a start as Elaine touched her arm. She was getting soft, letting people sneak up on her, jumping at a touch. "This crisis seems to be weathered," Elaine murmured. "Perhaps it's time to go before the next breaks out." A touch of color in her cheeks was the only sign that she had ever been angry. And a bit in Brigitta's. The two reflected one another in some ways since the bonding. "Past time," Avienda agreed. Much longer and she would be a milk-hearted wetlander. Every eye followed as she walked out into the open space in the center of the stable yard, to the spot she had studied and felt until she knew it with her eyelids closed. There was a joy in holding the power, a joy in working Saidar that she could not have put into words. To contain Saidar, to be contained by it, was to seem alive beyond any other time. A delusion, the wise ones said, as false and dangerous as a mirage of water in the turmoil. Yet it seemed more real than the paving stones beneath her feet. She fought the urge to draw more. Already she held nearly as much as she could. Everyone crowded close as she began to weave the flows. That there were things many Aes Sedai could not do still startled Avienda, after all she had seen. Several of the knitting circle were strong enough, but only Sumiko, and surprisingly, Rihanna openly studied what she was doing. Sumiko went so far as to shrug off the encouraging pats Nynaeve tried to give her, which earned a look of startled indignation from Nynaeve that Sumiko, her gaze fixed on Avienda, never saw. All of the Windfinders had sufficient strength. They watched as hungrily as they had stared at the bowl. The bargain gave them every right. Avienda focused, and the flows wove together, creating identity between this place and the place she and Elaine and Nynaeve had chosen on a map. She gestured as though opening tent flaps. That was no part of the weave Elaine had taught her, but it was almost all she could recall of what she herself had done long before Egwene made her first gateway. The flows coalesced into a silvery vertical slash that rotated and became an opening in the air, taller than a man and just as wide. Beyond lay a large clearing surrounded by trees 20 or 30 feet high, miles north of the city on the far side of the river. Knee-high brown grass came right up to the gateway, swaying through in a small breeze. It had not truly turned, only seemed to. Some of those blades were sliced cleanly, though, some lengthwise. The edges of an opening gateway made a razor seem dull. The gateway filled her with dissatisfaction. Elaine could make this weave with only a part of her strength, yet for some reason it required all but a fraction of Avienda's. She was sure she could have woven a larger, as large as Elaine could, using the weaves she had made without thought while trying to escape Rand al'Thor what seemed a very long time ago. But no matter how often she tried, only scraps came back to her. She felt no envy. Rather, she took pride in her near sister's accomplishments, but her own failure made shame surge in her heart. Sorelia or Amis would be hard on her if they knew that, about the shame. Too much pride, they would call it. Amis should understand. She had been a maiden. There was shame in failing at what you should be able to do. If she had not had to hold the weave, she would have run away so no one could see her. The departure had been carefully planned, and the whole stable yard sprang into motion as soon as the gateway opened fully. Two of the knitting circle pulled the hooded shadow runner to her feet, and the windfinders hurriedly formed a line behind Ranilad and Callan. The servants began bringing horses out of the stables. Lan, Brigitta, and one of Cariana's warders, a lanky man called Sierra Larjuna, immediately darted through the gateway, one behind the other. Like Far Dar Ismai, warders always claimed the right to scout ahead. Avienda's feet itched to run after them, but there was no point. Unlike Elaine, she could not move more than 5 or 6 steps without this weave beginning to weaken, and the same if she tried to tie it off. It was very frustrating. This time there was no real expectation of danger, so the Aes Sedai followed immediately, Elaine and Nynaeve as well. Farms dotted that treed area thickly, and a wandering shepherd or a young couple seeking privacy might need guidance away from seeing too much. But no shadow-souled or shadow runner could know that clearing. Only she, Elaine, and Nynaeve did, and they had not spoken in the choosing, for fear of eavesdroppers. Standing in the opening, Elaine gave Avienda a questioning look, but Avienda motioned her to go on. Plans were meant to be followed, unless there was reason to change them. The Windfinders began filing slowly through to the clearing, each suddenly irresolute as she approached this thing she had never dreamed of, taking a breath before she entered. And abruptly the prickling returned. Avienda's eyes rose to the windows overlooking the stable yard. Anyone might be hidden behind the white screens of intricate wrought iron and piercework carving. Tylan had ordered the servants to stay away from those windows, but who would stop Tylan, or Jolene, or... Something made her look higher, to the domes and towers. Narrow walks ringed some of those slim spires, and on one, very high, was a black shape haloed by a sharp nimbus from the sun behind. A man. Her breath caught. Nothing in his stance, hands on the stone railing, spoke of danger, yet she knew he was the one who put that crawling between her shoulder blades. One of the shadow-souled would not stand there simply watching, but that creature, that golem... Ice formed in her belly. He could be just a palace servant. He could be, but she did not believe it. No shame in knowing fear. Anxiously, she glanced at the women still edging through the gateway with agonizing slowness. Half the sea folk were gone, and the knitting circle waited behind the rest with the shadow runner firmly in hand, their own unease at the passage warring with resentment that the sea folk women were allowed to go first. If she voiced her suspicions, the kinswomen surely would run. Mere mention of the shadow soul dried their mouths and turned their bowels to water, while the Windfinders might well try to claim the bowl straight away. With them, the bowl stood above anything else. But only a blind fool stood scratching herself while a lion crept up on the herd she had been set to guard. She caught one of the Athaan Mier by a red silk sleeve. "Tell Elaine." A face like smooth black stone turned to her. The woman somehow made full lips seem thin. Her eyes were black pebbles, flat and hard. What message could she send that would not bring down all the trouble she feared from them? "Tell Elaine and Nynaeve to be wary. Tell them enemies always come when you least want them. You must say this to her without fail." The Windfinder nodded with barely concealed impatience, but surprisingly she waited for Avienda to release her before making her hesitant way through the gateway. The walk up on the tower stood empty. Avienda felt no relief. He could be anywhere, making his way down to the stable yard. Whoever he was, whatever he was dangerous. This was not a dust funnel dancing in her imagination. The last 4 warders had formed a square around the gateway, a guard who would be last to leave, and much as she despised their swords, she was grateful that someone there besides herself knew the use of sharp metal. Not that they would have any more chance against a golem, or worse, one of the shadow-souled, than the servants waiting with the horses, or than she herself. Grimly she drew the power until the sweetness of Saidar grew near to pain. A hair beyond, and pain would almost become blinding agony for the moments needed to die or lose the ability completely. Would those shuffling women quicken their feet? No shame in feeling fear, but she was very much afraid that hers was painted on her face. Chapter 2. Unweaving. Elaine stepped to one side as soon as she was through the gateway, but Nynaeve trampled across the clearing, kicking up brown grasshoppers from the dead grass and peering this way and that for evidence of the warders. Of one warder, anyway. A bright red bird flashed across the clearing and was gone. Nothing else moved except the sisters. A squirrel barked somewhere in the mostly leafless trees, and then there was silence. To Elaine, it seemed impossible those three could have passed this way without leaving paths as wide as that behind Nynaeve, yet she could not make out any sign that they had been there at all. She sensed Brigitte somewhere off to her left, roughly southwest, she thought, and feeling quite content, clearly in no immediate danger. Cariana, part of a protective circle gathered around Saritha and the bowl, cocked her head almost as if listening. Apparently her Sierral was to the southeast, which meant Lan was north. Oddly enough, north was the direction Nynaeve had settled down to watch, all the while muttering under her breath. Perhaps being married had created some sense of him in her. More likely she had noticed a track that escaped Elaine. Nynaeve was as skilled at woodscraft as she was with herbs. From where Elaine stood at first, Avienda was clearly visible through the gateway, studying the palace rooftops as if she expected an ambush. By her stance, she could have been carrying spears, ready to leap into battle in her riding dress. She made Elaine smile, hiding how distressed she was about her problems with the gateway, so much braver than she herself. But at the same time, she could not help worrying. Avienda was brave, and no one Elaine knew was better able to keep her head. She also might decide that Pt.2 required her to fight when there was no chance except in running. The light around her shone so brightly it was obvious she could not draw much more of Saidar. If one of the Forsaken did appear, I should have stayed with her. Elaine rejected the thought immediately. Whatever excuse she gave, Avienda would know the truth, and she was touchy as a man sometimes, most of the time, especially when it bore upon her honor. With a sigh, Elaine let the Athan Mier crowd her further from the gateway as they filed through. She stayed close enough to hear any shout on the other side, though, close enough to leap to Avienda's aid in a heartbeat. And for another reason. The Windfinders came through in order of rank, striving to keep their faces smooth, but even Renila relaxed tight shoulders once her bare feet were beating down the tall brown grass. Some gave a little shiver, quickly suppressed, or glanced back with round eyes at the opening hanging in mid-air. One and all, they stared at Elaine suspiciously as they stepped by her, and 2 or 3 opened their mouths, perhaps to ask what she was doing, perhaps to ask or tell her to move. She was just as glad that they hurried on in obedience to Renila's curt urgings. They would have their chance to tell Aes Sedai what to do soon enough. It did not have to start with her. That thought made her stomach sink, and the number of them made her shake her head. They had the knowledge of whether to use the bowl properly, yet even Renila agreed, if reluctantly, that the more power directed through the bowl, the better the chances of being able to heal the weather. It must be directed with a precision impossible except for one woman alone, or a circle, though. A full circle of 13 it had to be. That 13 certainly would include Nynaeve and Avienda and Elaine herself, and probably a few of the kin, but Renila plainly intended to jump on the part of the bargain that said they would be allowed to learn any abilities the Aes Sedai could teach. The gateway had been the first, and forming a circle would be the second. A wonder she had not brought every windfinder in the harbor. Imagine trying to deal with 300 or 400 of these women. Elaine offered a small prayer of thanks that there were only 20. She was not standing there to count them, though. As each windfinder passed, barely more than a pace away, she let herself feel the woman's strength and the power. Earlier, there had been time to get close enough to only a handful, what with all the trouble of convincing Renila to come at all. Apparently, achieving rank among the Windfinders had nothing to do with either age or strength. Renila was far from the strongest, even in the first 3 or 4, while one woman toward the rear, Senina, had weathered cheeks and thickly grayed hair. Strangely, by the marks in her ears, it seemed that Senina might once have worn more than 6 earrings, and thicker ones than she did now. Elaine sorted and stored away faces and the names she knew with a growing sense of complacency. The Windfinders might have secured an upper hand of sorts, and she and Nynaeve might be in deep trouble, very deep, with both Egwene and the Hall of the Tower once the terms of their bargain became known. But none of these women would stand particularly high among Aes Sedai. Certainly not low, but not high. She told herself not to feel smug. It changed nothing in what they had agreed, yet it was very hard not to. These were the best the Atha'an could produce, after all, here in Ebu Dar, anyway. And if they had been Aes Sedai, every one of them, from Kurin with her stony black stare to Rhaenyra herself, would have listened when she spoke and stood when she entered the room, if they were Aes Sedai and behaving as they should. And then the end of the line appeared, and she gave a start as a young windfinder off one of the smaller ships passed her, a round-cheeked woman called Rhaenyn in plain blue silks, with barely a half-dozen ornaments hanging from her nose chain. The 2 apprentices, boyishly slim Talan and big-eyed Matara, scurried at the very tail with harried expressions. They had not earned the nose ring yet, much less the chain, and only a single thin gold earring in the left ear balanced the 3 in the right. Her eyes followed the 3 of them, just short of staring, perhaps not short of it at that. The Atha'an Mier clustered with Rhaenyra again, most, like her, glaring hungrily at the Aes Sedai and the bowl. The last 3 women stood at the rear, the apprentices with the air of those uncertain whether they had a right to be there at all, Rhaenyn folding her arms in imitation of Rhaenyra, yet doing little better than the other 2. The Windfinder on a darter, the least of the sea-folk vessels, likely seldom found herself in company with the Windfinder to her clan wave mistress, not to mention the Windfinder to the mistress of the ships. Rhaenyn was easily as strong as Lelaine or Romanda, and Matara on a level with Elaine herself, while Talan, so meek in her red linen blouse, with eyes that seemed permanently downcast, came very close to Nynaeve. Very close. More, Elaine knew she herself had not yet reached her full potential, and neither had Nynaeve. How close were Matara and Talan? She had grown accustomed to knowing that only Nynaeve and the Forsaken were stronger than she. Well, Egwene, but she had been forced, and her own potential and Avienda's matched Egwene's. So much for complacency, she told herself ruefully. Linny would have said it was what she deserved for taking things for granted. Laughing softly at herself, Elaine turned back to check on Avienda, but the knitting circle stood rooted to one spot in front of the gateway, twitching at cold stares from Cariana and Saritha. All but Sumiko, and she did not move away either, for all that she had met the sisters' gazes. Kirstian appeared ready to burst into tears. Suppressing a sigh, Elaine herded the kinswomen out of the way of the stable folk waiting to bring the horses through. The knitting circle went along like sheep. She was the shepherd, Marililla and the rest the wolves, and they would have moved faster if not for Ispan. Famella, one of only 4 among the knitting circle without a touch of gray or white in her hair, and Eldays, a fierce-eyed woman when she was not looking at an Aes Sedai, held Ispan by the arms. They could not seem to decide between holding her firmly enough to keep her upright and not clutching her too tightly, with the result that the Black Sister moved in a bobbing fashion, sagging halfway to her knees when they loosened their grips, then pulled back up just before she fell completely. "Forgive me, Aes Sedai," Famella kept murmuring to Ispan with a faint Tarraboner accent. "Oh, I am sorry, Aes Sedai." Eldays winced and gave a little moan every time Ispan stumbled. Just as if Ispan had not helped murder 2 of their number and the light alone knew how many others. They were fussing over a woman who was going to die. The killings in the White Tower that Ispan had conspired at were enough to condemn her by themselves. "Take her over there somewhere," Elaine told them, waving away from the gateway into the clearing. They obeyed, bobbing curtsies and nearly dropping Ispan, murmuring apologies to Elaine and to the hooded prisoner. Rihanna and the rest scurried along, anxiously eyeing the sisters around Marililla. Almost immediately the war of glares started up again. The Aes Sedai at the kinswomen, the knitting circle at the windfinders, and the Afa'an Mier at anybody their eyes fell on. Elaine clamped her teeth shut. She was not going to shout at them. Nynaeve always got better results with yells anyway. But she did want to shake some sense into every one of them, shake them until their teeth rattled, including Nynaeve, who was supposed to be getting everyone organized instead of staring into the trees. But what if it had been Rand who was going to die, unless she could find a way to save him? Suddenly tears trembled on the edge of falling, stinging her eyes. Rand was going to die, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. "Peel the apple in your hand, girl, not the one on the tree," Linny's thin voice seemed to whisper in her ear. "Tears are for after. They just waste time before." "Thank you, Linny," Elaine murmured. Her old nurse was an irritating woman sometimes, never admitting that any of her charges had really grown up, but her advice was always good. Just because Nynaeve was slacking her duties was no reason for Elaine to slack hers. Servants had started trotting horses through right on the heels of the knitting circle, beginning with the pack horses. None of those first animals carried anything so frivolous as clothes. They could walk if the riding horses needed to be abandoned on the other side of the gateway, and wear what they stood up in if the rest of the pack animals had to be left behind. But what was on those first horses could not be left for the Forsaken. Elaine motioned the leather-cheeked woman leading the very first to follow her aside, out of the way of the others. Untying and tossing back the stiff canvas cover on one of the wide wicker panniers revealed a great heap of what appeared to be rubbish, stuffed in every which way, right up to the top, some of it wrapped in cloth that was falling to pieces. The greater part of it probably was rubbish. Embracing Saidar, Elaine began sorting. A rusted breastplate quickly went onto the ground, along with a broken table leg, a cracked platter, a badly dented pewter pitcher, and a bolt of rotted, unidentifiable cloth that almost broke apart in her hands. The storeroom where they found the Bowl of the Winds had been stuffed full. Things that should have been on a refuse heap jumbled in with more objects of the power than just the bowl, some in beetle-riddled casks or chests, some carelessly stacked. For hundreds and hundreds of years, the kin had hidden away all things they found that were connected to the power, fearful of using them, and fearful of delivering them to Aes Sedai, until that very morning. This was the first chance Elaine had had to see what was worth keeping. The light sen that the Dark Friends had not gotten away with anything important. They had taken some, but certainly less than a quarter of what the room had held, rubbish included. The light sen she found something they could use. People had died to bring these things out of the Rahad. She did not channel, just held the power as she lifted each item. A chipped clay cup, 3 broken plates, a child's moth-eaten dress, and an old boot with a hole worn through the side all fell to the ground. A stone carving a little larger than her hand. It felt like stone. It might have been a carving, though it did not exactly look carved for some reason, all deep blue curves vaguely like roots. It seemed to warm faintly at her touch. It held a resonance to Saidar. That was the closest word she could think of. What it was meant to do, she had no idea, but it was a Turangrial without any doubt. It went on the other side of her, away from the pile of rubbish. The heap of refuse continued to grow, but so did the other, if more slowly. Things that had nothing in common except the faint warmth and the sense of echoing the power. A small box that felt like ivory, covered in wavering red and green stripes. She set it down carefully without opening the hinged lid. You could never tell what might trigger a Turangrial. A black rod no thicker than her little finger, a pace in
Hey,
length,
Sam Scott, how you
stiff yet
doing?
so flexible she thought she could have doubled it into a circle. A tiny stoppered vial that might have
Happy
been
Friday,
crystal,
or
with a dark
now it's
red
what,
liquid
Happy
inside.
Saturday?
The figure of a stout, bearded man with a jolly smile holding a book. 2 feet tall, it appeared to be age-darkened bronze, and took both of her hands to move. Other things. Most was trash, though, and none was what she truly wanted. Not yet. Is this the time to be doing that? Nynaeve asked. She straightened hastily from the small cluster of Turangrial, grimacing and rubbing her hand on her skirt. That rod feels like pain, she muttered. The hard-faced woman holding the pack-horse's head blinked at the rod and edged away. Elaine eyed the rod. Nynaeve's occasional impressions about objects she touched could be useful, but she did not stop sorting. There had been too much pain lately to need any more, surely. Not that what Nynaeve sensed was always that straightforward. The rod might have been present when a great deal of pain was caused without being the cause in itself. The pannier was almost empty. Some of what was on the other side of the horse would have to be shifted to balance the weight. If there's an Angreal in this somewhere, Nynaeve, I would like to find it before Morgedian taps one of us on the shoulder. Nynaeve grunted sourly, but she peered into the wicker basket. Dropping another table leg, that made 3, none of which matched, Elaine spared a glance for the clearing. All of the pack horses were out, and the mounts were coming through the gateway now, filling the open space between the trees with bustle and confusion. Marililla and the other Aes Sedai already sat their saddles, barely concealing their impatience to be off, while Pole fussed hurriedly with her mistress's saddlebags. But the Windfinders, graceful afoot, graceful on their ships, they were unused to horses. Ranila was trying to mount from the wrong side, and the gentle bay mare chosen for her danced slow circles around the liveried man who was gripping the bridle with one hand, while tugging his hair in frustration with the other, and vainly trying to correct the Windfinder. 2 of the stable women were attempting to hoist Dorilla, who served the wave mistress of Clan Somarin, into her saddle, while a third, holding the grey's head, wore the tight face of someone trying not to laugh. Raynin was on the back of a leggy brown gelding, but somehow without either foot in the stirrups or the reins in her hands, and having considerable trouble finding any of them. And those 3 seemed to be having the easiest time of it. Horses whinnied and danced and rolled their eyes, and Windfinders shouted curses in voices that could have been heard over a gale. One of them knocked a serving man flat with her fist, and 3 more stable folk were trying to catch mounts that had gotten free. There was also what she had expected to see, if Nynaeve was no longer keeping her private watch. Lan stood by his black warhorse, Mandarb, dividing his gaze between the tree line, the gateway, and Nynaeve. Brigitte came striding out of the woods, shaking her head, and a moment later Sierra trotted from the trees, but with no sense of urgency. There was nothing out there to threaten or inconvenience them. Nynaeve was watching her, eyebrows raised high. I didn't say anything, Elaine said. Her hand closed on something small, wrapped in rotting cloth that might have been white once, or brown. She knew immediately what was inside. A good thing for you, Nynaeve grumbled, not quite far enough under her breath. I can't abide women who poke their noses into other people's business. Elaine let it pass without so much as a start. She was proud that she did not have to bite her tongue. Stripping away the decayed cloth revealed a small amber brooch in the shape of a turtle. It looked like amber anyway, and it might have been amber once, but when she opened herself to the source through it, Saidar rushed into her, a torrent compared to what she could draw safely on her own. Not a strong Angreal, but far better than nothing. With it she could handle twice as much of the power as Nynaeve, and Nynaeve herself would do better still. Releasing the extra flow of Saidar, she slipped the brooch into her belt pouch with a smile of delight, and went back to searching. Where there was one, there might be more. And now that she had one to study, she might be able to reason out how to make an Angreal. That was something she had wished for. It was all she could do not to take the brooch out again and begin probing it right there. Vandine had been eyeing Nynaeve and her for some time, and now she heeled her slab-sided gelding over to them and dismounted. The groom at the pack-horse's head managed a decent, if awkward, curtsy, more than she had for Elaine or Nynaeve. "You're being careful," Vandine said to Elaine, "and that's very good. But it might be better to leave these things alone until they're in the tower." Elaine's mouth tightened. In the tower? Until they could be examined by someone else was what she meant. Someone older and supposedly more experienced. "I do know what I'm doing, Vandine. I have made Terangreal, after all. Nobody else living has done that." She had taught the basics to some sisters, but no one had managed the trick of it by the time she left for Ebudar. The older Green nodded, flipping her reins idly against the palm of her riding glove. "Martina Janata also knew what she was doing. So I understand," she said casually. "She was the last sister to really make a business of studying Terangreal. She did it for over 40 years, almost from the time she reached the shawl. She was careful, too, so I was told. Then one day Martina's maid found her unconscious on the floor of her sitting room. Burned out." Even in a conversational tone, those words were a sharp slap. Vandine's voice did not alter a hair, though. Her warder was dead from the shock. Not unusual in cases like that. When Martina came to, 3 days later, she couldn't recall what she'd been working with. She couldn't remember the preceding week at all. That was more than 25 years ago, and no one since has had the nerve to touch any of the Terangreal that were in her rooms. Her notes mentioned every last one, and everything she had discovered was innocuous, innocent, even frivolous. But Vandine shrugged. She found something she wasn't expecting. Elaine peeked at Brigitte and found Brigitte looking back at her. She did not need to see the worried frown on the other woman's face. It was mirrored in her mind, in the small patch of her mind that was Brigitte, and in the rest. Brigitte felt her worry, and she felt Brigitte's, until sometimes it was hard to say which was which. She risked more than herself. But she did know what she was doing, more than anyone else there at least. And even if none of the Forsaken appeared, they needed all of the Angreal she could find. "What happened to Martina?" Nynaeve asked quietly. "Afterward, I mean." She could seldom hear of anyone being hurt without wanting to heal them. She wanted to heal everything. Vandine grimaced. She might have been the one to bring up Martina, but Aes Sedai did not like talking about women who had been burned out or stilled. They did not like remembering them. "She vanished once she was well enough to slip out of the tower," she said hurriedly. "The important thing to remember is that she was cautious. I never met her, but I've been told she treated every Terangreal as if she had no idea what it might do next, even the one that makes the cloth for warders' cloaks, and nobody has ever been able to make that do anything else. She was careful, and it did her no good." Nynaeve laid an arm across the nearly empty pannier. "Maybe you really should," she began. "No!" Marililla shrieked. Elaine spun, instinctively opening herself through the Angreal again, only half conscious of Saidar flooding into Nynaeve and Vandine. The glow of the power sprang up around every woman in the clearing who could embrace the source. Marililla was straining forward in her saddle, eyes bulging, one hand reaching toward the gateway. Elaine frowned. There was nothing there except Avienda and the last 4 warders, startled in the middle of walking away, searching for the threat with swords half drawn. Then she realized what Avienda was doing, and nearly lost Saidar in her shock. The gateway trembled as Avienda carefully picked apart the weave that had made it. It shivered and flexed, the edges wavering. The last flows came loose, and instead of winking out, the opening shimmered, the view through it of the courtyard fading away until it evaporated like mist in the sun.
Go to some reclaim.
That is impossible, Renila said incredulously. An astonished murmur of agreement broke out among the windfinders. The kinswomen gaped at Avienda, mouths working soundlessly. Elaine nodded slowly in spite of herself. Clearly it was possible, but one of the first things she had been told as a novice was that never, ever under any circumstances was she to try what Avienda had just done. Picking apart a weave, any weave, rather than simply letting it dissipate, could not be done, as she had been told, not without inevitable disaster. Inevitable. "You fool girl!" Van Deen snapped, her face a thunderhead. She strode toward Avienda, dragging her gelding behind. "Do you realize what you almost did? One slip. One! And there's no saying what the weave will snap into or what it will do. You could have completely destroyed everything for 100 paces. 500. Everything. You could have burned yourself out, and it was necessary." Avienda cut in. A babble erupted from the mounted Aes Sedai crowding around her and Van Deen, but she glared at them and raised her voice over theirs. "I know the dangers, Van Deen Namel, but it was necessary. Is this another thing you Aes Sedai cannot do? The wise ones say any woman can learn if she is taught. Some women more and some less. But any woman, if she can pick out embroidery." She did not quite sneer. Not quite. "This is not embroidery, girl." Marililla's voice was deep winter ice. "Whatever so-called training you received among your people, you cannot possibly know what you are playing with. You will promise me, swear to me that you will never do this again." "Her name should be in the novice book," Saritha said firmly, glaring across the bowl still held firmly to her bosom. "I've always said it. She should be entered in the book." Cariana nodded, her stern gaze measuring Avienda for a novice dress. "That might not be necessary for the moment," Adelius told Avienda, leaning forward in her saddle. "But you must let yourself be guided by us." The Brown sister's tone was much milder than the others, yet she was not making a suggestion. A month or so earlier, Avienda might have begun to wilt under all that Aes Sedai disapproval, but not now. Elaine hurriedly pushed in among the horses before her friend decided to draw the knife she was fondling, or to do something worse. "Maybe somebody should ask why she thought it was necessary," she said, slipping an arm around Avienda's shoulders as much to keep her arms at her sides as for comfort. Avienda did not quite include her in the exasperated look she gave the other sisters. "This leaves no residue," she said patiently. Too patiently. "The residues of a weave this large might be read 2 days from now." Marililla snorted, a very strong sound to come from that slight body. "That is a rare talent, girl. Neither Teslin nor Jolene has it. Or do you Aiel Wilders all learn that as well?" "Few can do it," Avienda admitted calmly. "But I can." That produced a different sort of stare from Elaine as well. It was a very rare talent. She did not seem to notice. "Do you claim that none of the Shadow-Souled can?" she went on. The tightness of her shoulder under Elaine's hand said she was not so cool as she pretended. "Are you such fools that you leave tracks for your enemies to follow? Any who could read the residues could make a gateway to this spot. That would have taken great dexterity, very great dexterity, but the suggestion was enough to leave Marililla blinking. Adelius opened her mouth, then closed it without speaking, and Van Deen frowned thoughtfully. Saritha simply looked worried. Who could say what talents the Forsaken had, what skill? Strangely, all the fierceness drained out of Avienda. Her eyes fell, her shoulders loosened. "Perhaps I should not have taken the risk," she muttered. "With that man watching me, I could not think clearly, and when he disappeared—" A little of her spirit returned, but not a great deal. "I do not think a man could read my weaves," she said to Elaine. But if he was one of the shadow-souled, or even the golem, the shadow-souled no more than any of us. If I was wrong, I have great toil, but I do not think I was. I do not think it. What man? Nynaeve demanded. Her hat had been knocked askew in pushing among the horses, and that, with the tight frown she directed at everyone impartially, made her look ready for a fight. Perhaps she was. Cariana's gelding accidentally nudged her with a shoulder, and she swatted the blue dun's nose. A servant, Marililla said dismissively. Whatever orders Tylin gave, Altaran servants are an independent lot. Or perhaps her son. That boy is too curious by half. The sisters around her nodded, and Cariana said, One of the Forsaken would hardly have stood and watched. You said so yourself. She was patting her gelding's neck and frowning accusingly at Nynaeve. Cariana was one of those who gave her horse the sort of affection most people reserved for infants. She was frowning at Nynaeve, and Nynaeve took the words for her, too. Maybe it was a servant, and maybe it was Beslan. Maybe. Nynaeve's sniff said she did not believe it, or that she wanted them to believe she did not. She could tell you to your face that you were a blind idiot, yet let anyone else say it and she would defend you until she went hoarse. Of course, she did not seem ready to decide whether she liked Avienda, but she definitely did not like the older Aes Sedai. She tugged her hat almost straight, and her frown swept across them, then started over. Whether it was Beslan or the Dark One, there's no call to stand here all day. We need to get ready and move on to the farm. Well, move! She clapped her hands sharply, and even Van Deen gave a little start. There was little preparation left to do when the sisters moved their horses away. Lan and the other warders had not sat on their heels once they realized there was no danger. Some of the servants had gone back through the gateway before Avienda disposed of it, but the rest stood with the 36 or so pack horses, occasionally glancing at the Aes Sedai, clearly wondering what marvel they might produce next. The Windfinders were all mounted, if awkwardly, and holding their reins as though expecting their horses to bolt any moment, or perhaps sprout wings and take flight. So were the knitting circle, with a good deal more grace, unconcerned that their skirts and petticoats were pushed up past their knees, and with Ispan still hooded and tied across a saddle like a sack. She could not possibly have sat upright on a horse, yet even Sumiko's eyes popped whenever they touched her. Glaring about her, Nynaeve looked ready to tongue-lash everybody into doing what they had already done, but only until Lan handed her the reins of her plump brown mare. She had adamantly refused the gift of a better horse from Tylin. Her hand trembled a little when it touched Lan's, and her face changed color as she swallowed the anger she had been about to unleash. When he offered a hand for her foot, she stared at him for a moment as if wondering what he was about, then colored again when he boosted her to her saddle. Elaine could only shake her head. She hoped she did not turn into an idiot when she married, if she married. Brigitte brought her silvery gray mare, and the yellow dun Avienda rode, but she seemed to understand that Elaine wanted a private word with Avienda. She nodded almost as if Elaine had spoken, swung up onto her mouse-colored gelding, and rode to where the other warders were waiting. They greeted her with nods and began discussing something in low voices. By the glances directed at the sisters, the something had to do with taking care of Aes Sedai, whether Aes Sedai wanted care taken or not. Including herself, Elaine noted grimly. There was no time now for that, though. Avienda stood fiddling with her horse's reins, staring at the animal like a novice staring at a kitchen full of greasy pots. Very likely, Avienda saw a small difference between having to scrub pots and having to ride. Snugging her green riding gloves, Elaine casually shifted Lioness to block them from the other's view, then touched Avienda's arm. Talking to Adelius or Van Deen might help, she said gently. She had to be very careful here, as careful as with any Terangreal. They're old enough to know more than you might suspect. There has to be a reason you've been having trouble with traveling. That was a mild way of putting it. Avienda almost had failed to make the weave work at all in the beginning. Careful. Avienda was far more important than any ter'angreal ever could be. They might be able to help. How can they? Avienda stared stiffly at the saddle on her gelding. They cannot travel. How could any of them know how to help? Abruptly, her shoulders slumped, and she turned her head to Elaine. Shockingly unshed tears glistened in her green eyes. That isn't the truth, Elaine. Not the whole truth. They cannot help, but you are my near sister. You have the right to know. They think I panicked at a servant. If I ask for help, it must all come out. That I traveled once to run from a man I hoped in my soul would catch me. To run like a rabbit. To run wanting to be caught. How could I let them know such shame? Even if they really could help, how could I? Elaine wished she did not know. About the catching part, at least. About the fact that Rand had caught her. Snatching the flecks of jealousy that suddenly were floating through her, she pushed them into a sack and stuffed it into the back of her head. Then she jumped up and down on it for good measure. When a woman plays the fool, look for the man. That was one of Leanie's favorites. Another was, kittens tangle your yarn, men tangle your wits, and it's simple as breathing for both. She drew a deep breath. No one will know from me, Avienda. I'll help you as much as I can, if I can figure out how. Not that there was much she could think to do. Avienda was remarkably quick at seeing how weaves were formed, much quicker than she herself. Avienda merely nodded and scrambled clumsily into her saddle, showing a bit more grace than the sea folk. There was a man watching Elaine, and he was no servant. Looking Elaine right in the eye, she added, He frightened me. An admission she likely would have made to no one else in the world. We're safe from him now, whoever he was, Elaine said, turning Linus to follow Nynaeve and Lan from the clearing. In truth, it very likely had been a servant, but she would never tell that to anyone, Avienda least of all. We're safe, and in a few more hours we will reach the Kin's farm, we'll use the bowl, and the world will be right again. Well, somewhat. The sun seemed lower than it had in the stable yard, but she knew that was only imagination. For once, they had gained a clear jump on the shadow.
From behind a screen of white wrought iron, Moradin watched the last of the horses vanish through the gateway, and then the tall young woman and the 4 warders. It was possible they were carrying away some item he could use, an angreal attuned to men, perhaps, but the chances were small. For the rest, the ter'angreal, the greatest likelihood was that they would kill themselves trying to puzzle out how to use them. Samael was a fool to have risked so much to seize a collection of no one knew what. But then Samael had never been half as clever as he thought. He himself would not disrupt his own plans merely on the off chance to see what scraps of civilization he could find. Only idle curiosity had brought him here. He liked to know what others thought important. But it was dross. He was about to turn away when the outlines of the gateway suddenly began to flex and tremble. Transfixed, he watched until the opening simply melted. He had never been a man to give way to obscenities, but several rose in his mind. What had the woman done? These barbarous rustics offered too many surprises. A way to heal being severed, however imperfectly, that was impossible. Except that they had done it. Involuntary rings. Those warders and the bond they shared with their Aes Sedai. He had known of that for a long, long time, but whenever he thought he had the measure of them, these primitives revealed some new skill, did something that no one in his own age had dreamed of. Something the pinnacle of civilization had not known. What had the girl done? Great Master. Moradin barely turned his head from the window. Yes, Matic? Her soul be damned, what had the girl done? The balding man in green and white, who had slipped into the small room, bowed deeply before falling to his knees. One of the upper servants in the palace, Matic, with his long face, possessed a pompous dignity that he tried to maintain even now. Moradin had seen men who stood far higher do far worse. Great Master, I have learned what the Aes Sedai brought to the palace this morning. It is said they found a great treasure hidden in ancient days, gold and jewels and heartstone, artifacts from Shiota and Aharon, and even the Age of Legends. There are said to be things among them that use the One power. It is said that one can control the weather. No one knows where they are going, Great Master. The palace is aquiver with talk, but 10 tongues name 10 different destinations. Moradin went back to studying the stable-yard below as soon as Maddox spoke. Ridiculous tales of gold and Quaindiar held no interest. Nothing would make a gateway behave that way, unless... Could she actually have unraveled the web? Death held no fear for him. Coldly, he considered the possibility that he had been within sight of an unraveling web, one that had been unmade successfully. Another impossibility, casually offered up by these... Something Matic had said caught his ear. The weather, Matic? The shadows of the palace spires had barely lengthened from their bases, but there was not a cloud to shield the baking city. Yes, Great Master. It is called the Bowl of the Winds. The name meant nothing to him, but a ter'angreal to control the weather. In his own age, weather had been carefully regulated with the use of ter'angreal. One of the surprises of this age, one of the smaller it had seemed, was that there were those who could manipulate weather to a degree that should have required one of those ter'angreal. One such device should not be enough to affect even a large part of a single continent. But what could these women do with it? What if they used a ring? He seized the true power without thought, the saw billowing black across his side. His fingers tightened in the wrought iron grill across the window. The metal groaned, twisting, not from his grip, but from the tendrils of the true power, drawn from the Great Lord himself, that wreathed around the grillwork, flexing as he flexed his hand in anger. The Great Lord would not be pleased. He had strained from his prison to touch the world enough to fix the seasons in place. He was impatient to touch the world more, to shatter the void that contained him, and he would not be pleased. Rage enveloped Moradin, blood pounding in his ears. A moment past, he had not cared where those women went, but now, somewhere far from here, people fleeing ran as far and as fast as they could, somewhere they felt safe. No use sending Matic to ask questions, no use squeezing anyone here. They would not have been fool enough to leave anyone behind alive who knew their destination. Not to Tarvan, to Althor, to that band of rebel Aes Sedai. In all 3 places he had eyes, some that did not know they served him. All would serve him before the end. He would not allow chance slips to spoil his plans now. Abruptly, he heard something other than the thundering drumbeat of his own fury, a bubbling sound. He looked at Matic curiously and stepped back from the spreading puddle on the floor. It seemed that, in his anger, he had seized at more than the wrought iron screen with the true power. Remarkable how much blood could be squeezed from a human body. He let what remained of the man fall without regret, indeed thinking only that when Matic was found, the Aes Sedai would surely be blamed. A small addition to the chaos growing in the world. Ripping a hole in the fabric of the pattern, he traveled with the true power. He had to find those women before they used this bowl of the winds. And failing that, he disliked people meddling with his carefully laid plans. Those who did so and lived to pay. The golem stepped into the room cautiously, nostrils already twitching with the scent of still-hot blood. The livid burn on its cheek seemed like a live coal. The golem appeared to be merely a slender man, a little taller than average in this time, yet it had never encountered anything that could harm it. Until that man with the medallion. What might have been smile or snarl bared its teeth. Curious, it peered around the room, but there was nothing beyond the crushed corpse on the floor tiles. And feel of something. Not the one power, but something that made it itch, if not quite in the same way. Curiosity had brought it here. Parts of the grill over the window were crushed, pulling the whole thing loose at the sides. The golem seemed to remember something that made it itch in that manner, yet so much of what it recalled was fogged and dim. The world had changed, as it seemed, in the blink of an eye. There had been a world of war and killing on a huge scale, with weapons that reached across miles, across thousands of miles. And then there was this. But the golem had not changed. It was still the most dangerous weapon of all. Its nostrils flared again, though it was not by scent that it tracked those who could channel. The one power had been used below and miles to the north. To follow or not? The man who had wounded it was not with them. It had made sure of that before leaving the high vantage place. The one who commanded it wanted the man who had wounded it dead, perhaps as much as he did the women. But the women were an easier target. The women had been named too, and for the time being, it was constrained. For its entire existence, it had been compelled to obey one or another human, but its mind held the concept of not being constrained. It must follow the women it wanted to follow. The moment of death, when it felt the ability to channel vanish along with life, produced ecstasy, rapture. But it was hungry, too. And there was time. Where they could run, it could follow. Settling fluidly beside the mangled body, it began to feed. Fresh blood, hot blood, was a necessity. But human blood always held the sweetest savor.
Chapter 3. A pleasant ride. Farms and pastures and olive groves covered most of the land around Ebudar, but many small forests stretched a few miles across as well, and while the ground was much flatter than the Rannon Hills to the south, it rolled and sometimes rose in a prominence of 100 feet or higher, sufficient to cast deep shadows in the afternoon sun. All in all, the country provided more than enough cover to keep unwanted eyes from what might have passed as some odd merchant's pack train. Nearly 50 people mounted, and almost as many afoot, especially when it had warders to find unfrequented paths through the undergrowth. Elaine did not sight a mark of human habitation beyond a few goats cropping on some of the hills. Even plants and trees used to heat were beginning to wither and die, yet at any other time she might have enjoyed nearly seeing the countryside. It could have been 1,000 leagues from the land she had seen riding down the other bank of the Eldar. The hills were strange knobby shapes, as though squeezed together by huge, careless hands. Flocks of brilliantly hued birds soared up at their passing, and a dozen sorts of hummingbirds flitted away from the horses, hovering jewels on blurred wings. Thick vines hung like ropes in some places, and there were trees with bundles of narrow fronds at the top for foliage, and things that looked like green feather dusters as tall as a man. A handful of plants, fooled by the heat, struggled to put out blossoms, bright reds and vivid yellows, some twice as wide as her 2 hands. Their perfume was lush, and sultry came to mind. She saw some boulders she would have wagered had once been toes on a statue, though why anyone would make a statue that large with bare feet she could not imagine. And another time the way led through a forest of thick fluted stones among the trees, the weathered stumps of columns, many toppled, and all long since mined almost to the ground for their stone by local farmers. A pleasant ride, despite the dust the horses' hooves raised from parched soil. The heat did not touch her, of course, and there were not very many flies. All the dangers lay behind them. They had outrun the Forsaken, and no chance any of them or their servants could catch up now. It could have been a pleasant ride, except... For one thing, Avienda learned that the message she had sent about enemies coming when least expected had not been delivered. At first, Elaine felt relief at anything to change the topic from Rand. It was not the jealousy come back. Rather, more and more, she found herself wanting what Avienda had shared with him. Not jealousy, envy. She would almost have preferred the other. Then she began really hearing what her friend was saying in a low monotone, and the hair on the back of her neck tried to stand. "You can't do that," she protested, reining her horse closer to Avienda's. Actually, she supposed Avienda would not have much trouble drubbing Kurin or tying her up or any of the rest. If the other sea folk women stood still for it anyway. "We can't start a war with them. Certainly not before we use the bow. And not over this," she added hastily. "Not at all." They certainly were not going to start a war before or after the bowl was used. Not just because the Windfinders were behaving more high-handedly by the hour. Not just because... Drawing breath, she hurried on. "If she had told me, I would not have known what you meant. I understand why you couldn't speak more clearly, but you do see, don't you?" Avienda glared ahead at nothing, absently brushing flies away from her face. "Without fail, I told her," she grumbled. "Without fail. What if he had been one of the Shadow sold? What if he had managed to get by me through the gateway, and you with no warning? What if..." She turned a suddenly forlorn gaze on Elaine. "I will bite my knife," she said sadly, "but my liver may burst for it." Elaine was about to say that swallowing her anger was the right thing to do, and she could pitch as large a fit as she wanted, so long as she did not hurl it at the Afa'an-Mier. That was what all that about knives and livers meant. But before she could open her mouth, Adelius brought her rangy gray up on her other side. The white-haired sister had acquired a new saddle in Ebudar, a gaudy thing worked with silver on pommel and cantle. The flies seemed to avoid her for some reason, though she wore a scent as strong as any of the flowers. "Pardon me, I could not help overhearing that last." Adelius did not sound at all apologetic, and Elaine wondered just how much she had overheard. She felt her cheeks coloring. Some of what Avienda had said about Rand had been remarkably frank and straightforward. Some of what she had said had been, too. It was one thing to talk that way with your nearest friend, quite another to suspect someone else had been listening. Avienda seemed to feel the same way. She did not blush, but the sour look she shot at the brown would have done Nynaeve proud. Adelius merely smiled, a vague smile as bland as water soup. "It might be best if you gave your friend there free rein with the Afa'an-Mier." She peered past Elaine at Avienda, blinking. "Well, a loose rein. Putting the fear of the light into them ought to be sufficient. They're almost there already, in case you haven't noticed. They're much more wary of the savage Aiel, forgive me, Avienda, than they are of Aes Sedai. Marililla would have suggested it, but her ears are still burning." Avienda's face rarely gave much away, but right then she looked as puzzled as Elaine felt. Elaine twisted in her saddle to frown behind her. Marililla rode abreast with Vandine, Cariana, and Saritha not far back, all very studiously looking at anything except Elaine. Beyond the sisters were the sea folk, still in single file, and then would come the knitting circle, keeping themselves out of sight for the moment just ahead of the pack horses. They were threading away through the glades of truncated columns. 50 or 100 long-tailed red and green birds winged over their heads, filling the air with chattering cries. "Why?" Elaine asked curtly. It seemed foolish to add to the turmoil already bubbling just below the surface, and sometimes on the surface, but she had seen no hint of the fool in Adelius. The brown sister's eyebrows rose in apparent surprise. Maybe she was surprised. Adelius usually thought anyone should see what she saw. Maybe. "Why? To restore a little balance, that is why. If the Afa'an-Mier feel they need us to protect them from an Aiel, it might be a useful balance against..." Adelius paused slightly, suddenly absorbed in adjusting her pale gray skirts. "Other things." Elaine's face tightened. Other things. The bargain with the sea folk was what Adelius meant. You may ride with the others, she said coolly. Adelius made no protest, no attempts to press her argument. She just inclined her head and let her horse fall back. Her small smile never altered a whit. The older Aes Sedai accepted that Nynaeve and Elaine stood above them and spoke with Egwene's authority at their backs, but the truth was that changed little beyond the surface. Perhaps nothing. They were outwardly respectful, they obeyed, and yet... After all was said and done, Elaine, at least, was Aes Sedai at an age when most initiates of the Tower still wore novice white, and very few had reached the accepted. And she and Nynaeve had agreed to that bargain, hardly a display of wisdom and acumen. Not just the sea folk getting the bowl, but 20 sisters going to the Atha an Mier, subject to their laws, required to teach anything the Windfinders wanted to learn, and unable to leave until others came to replace them. Windfinders allowed to enter the Tower as guests, allowed to learn whatever they wished, leave whenever they wished. Those alone would make the hall scream, and probably Egwene as well, yet the rest... Every last one of the older sisters thought she would have found a way around making that bargain. Perhaps they really could have. Elaine did not believe it, but she was not sure. She did not say anything to Avienda, but after a few moments the other woman spoke. If I can serve honor and help you at the same time, I do not care whether it serves some Aes Sedai end. She never seemed to take it in that Elaine was also Aes Sedai. Not completely. Elaine hesitated, then nodded. Something had to be done to temper the sea folk. Marililla and the others had displayed a remarkable forbearance so far, but how long would that last? Nynaeve might explode once she actually turned her attentions to the Windfinders. Matters had to be kept as smooth as possible for as long as possible, but if the Atha an Mier went on believing they could stare down any Aes Sedai, there would be trouble. Life was more complex than she had imagined back in Camelin, no matter how many lessons she had received as daughter heir. So much more complicated since she entered the Tower. Just don't be too emphatic, she said softly. And please, have a care. There are 20 of them after all, and only one of you. I wouldn't want anything to happen before I could help you. Avienda gave her a grin with a good bit of wolf in it, and drew her dun mare off at the edge of the stones to wait for the Atha an Mier. From time to time, Elaine glanced back, but all she saw through the trees was Avienda riding next to Curin, speaking quite calmly and not even looking at the sea folk woman. Certainly not glaring, though Curin seemed to stare at her with considerable astonishment. When Avienda thumped her horse back up to join Elaine, flapping her reins, she would never be a horsewoman. Curin rode forward to speak with Rhaonyla, and a short time later Rhaonyla angrily sent Rhaenyn to the head of the column. The most junior of the Windfinders sat her horse even more awkwardly than Avienda, whom she pretended to ignore on Elaine's other side, just as she ignored the small green flies buzzing around her dark face. Rhaonyla din Callan Bluestar, she said stiffly, demands that you snub in the Aiel woman, Elaine Aes Sedai. Avienda grinned toothily at her, and Rhaenyn must have been watching at least a little because her cheeks reddened beneath the sheen of sweat. Tell Rhaonyla that Avienda is not Aes Sedai, Elaine replied. I will ask her to be careful. No lie there, she had and would again. But I can't make her do anything. On impulse, she added, You know how Aiel are. The sea folk had some very odd ideas of how the Aiel were. Rhaenyn stared wide-eyed at a still grinning Avienda, her face going gray, then jerked her horse around and galloped back to Rhaonyla, bouncing in her saddle. Avienda gave a pleased chuckle, but Elaine wondered whether the whole notion had been a mistake. Even with a good 30 paces between them, she could see Rhaonyla's face swell up at Rhaenyn's report, and the others began to buzz like bees. They did not look frightened, they looked angry, and the glares they directed at the Aes Sedai ahead of them grew baleful. Not at Avienda, at the sisters. Adelius nodded thoughtfully when she saw that, and Marillilla just barely failed to hide a smile. At least they were pleased. If that had been the only incident during the ride, it would have taken the edge off any enjoyment of flowers and birds, but it was not even the first. Beginning shortly after leaving the clearing, the knitting circle had made their way forward to Elaine one by one, all but Christian, and no doubt she would have come too had she not been ordered to keep Ispan shielded. One by one they came, each hesitant, smiling timorously until Elaine wanted to tell them to act their ages. They certainly made no demands, and they were too smart to ask straight out for what already had been denied, but they found other paths. "It occurred to me," Rihanna said brightly, "that you must want to question Ispansadai quite urgently. Who can say what else she was up to in the city besides trying to find the storeroom?" She pretended to just be making conversation, but from time to time she darted quick looks at Elaine to see how she was taking it. "I'm sure we'll take over an hour to reach the farm, the way we're going, perhaps 2, and you certainly don't want to waste 2 hours. The herbs Nynaeve said I gave her make her quite talkative, and I'm sure she would sit up for sisters." The bright smile faded when Elaine said that questioning Ispan could wait and would. Light. Did they really expect anyone to ask questions riding through forests on paths that barely deserved the name? Rihanna rode back to the other kinswomen, muttering to herself. "Forgiveness, Elaine Sedai," Chilaris murmured a short time later, the traces of Murundi clinging to her accent. Her green straw hat matched some of her layered petticoats exactly. "Your forgiveness, if I intrude." She did not wear the red belt of a wise woman. Most of the knitting circle did not. Pamela was a goldsmith, and Eldays supplied lacquerware to the merchants for export. Chilares was a rug seller, while Rihanna herself arranged shipping for small traders. Some worked at simple tasks. Kirstian ran a tiny weaver's shop, and Dimana was a seamstress, though a prosperous one. But then in the course of their lives they had all followed many crafts, and used many names. "Ispansadai appears to be unwell," Chilares said, shifting uneasily in her saddle. "Perhaps the herbs are affecting her more than Nynaeve Sedai thought. It would be terrible if anything happened to her. Before she can be questioned, I mean. Perhaps the sisters would look at her? Healing, you know." She trailed off, blinking those big brown eyes nervously. As well she might, with Sumiko among her companions. A glance back showed the stout woman standing in her stirrups to peer past the windfinders until she saw Elaine looking and sat back down hurriedly. Sumiko, who knew more of healing than any sister except Nynaeve, perhaps more than Nynaeve. Elaine simply pointed to the rear until Chilaris colored and reined her mount around. Marillilla joined Elaine only moments after Rihanna left, and the Grey sister made a much better pretense at simple chat than the kinswoman had. In her manner of speaking, at least, she was poise itself. What she had to say was another matter. "I wonder how trustworthy those women are, Elaine." Her lips pursed in distaste as she brushed dust from her divided blue skirts with a gloved hand. "They say they do not take in wilders, but Rihanna herself may well be a wilder, whatever she claims about failing her test for accepted. Sumiko as well, and certainly Kirstian." A slight frown for Kirstian, a dismissive shake of her head. "You must have noticed how she leaps at any mention of the tower. She knows no more than she might have picked up in conversation with someone who really was put out." Marillilla sighed, regretting what she had to say. She really was very good. "Have you considered that they may be lying about other things? They could be dark friends, for all we know, or dupes of dark friends. Perhaps not, but they are hardly to be trusted very far. I believe there is a farm, whether they really use it for a retreat or not, or I would not have agreed to this. But I will not be surprised to find a few ramshackle buildings and a dozen or so wilders. Well, not ramshackle. They do seem to have coin, but the principle is the same. No, they are simply not trustworthy." Elaine began a slow burn as soon as she realized the direction Marililla was taking, and it grew hotter. All this slipping around, all this may and could, so the woman could insinuate things she herself did not believe. Dark friends? The knitting circle had fought dark friends. 2 had died. And without Sumiko and Iaina, Nynaeve might be dead instead of Ispan a prisoner. No, the reason they were not to be trusted was not because Marililla feared they were sworn to the shadow, or she would have said so. They were not to be trusted because if they were not to be trusted, then they could not be allowed to hold Ispan. She swatted a big green fly that had settled on Lioness's neck, punctuating Marililla's last word with a loud crack, and the Grey sister jerked in surprise. "How dare you?" Elaine breathed. They faced Ispan and Phalion in the Rahad and the Golem, not to mention 2 dozen or more toughs with swords. You weren't there. That was hardly fair. Marililla and the rest had been left behind because Aes Sedai in the Rahad, obvious Aes Sedai, might as well be trumpets and drums for the attention they attracted. She did not care. Her anger grew by the moment, and her voice rose by the word. "You will never suggest such a thing to me again. Never. Not without hard evidence. Not without proof. If you do, I'll set you a penance that will make your eyes pop." No matter how high she stood above the other woman, she had no authority to set her any penance at all, but she did not care about that either. "I'll make you walk all the way to Tar Valon, eating nothing but bread and water the entire way. I'll put you in their charge and tell them to slap you down if you say boo to a goose." It dawned on her that she was shouting. Some sort of gray and white birds went flittering past overhead in a broad band, and she was drowning out their cries. Drawing a deep breath, she tried to calm herself. She did not have a voice for shouting. It always came out as a shriek. Everyone was looking at her, most in astonishment. Avienda nodded approvingly. Of course, she would have done the same had Elaine plunged a knife into Marililla's heart. Avienda stood beside her friends no matter what. Marililla's Kyrianan paleness had become dead white. "I mean what I say," Elaine told her, in a much cooler tone. It seemed to make even more blood leave Marililla's face. She did mean every word. They could not afford that sort of rumor floating among them. One way or another she would see it done, though the knitting circle very likely would faint. She hoped that was the end of it. It should have been. But when Chilares left, Saritha replaced her, and she too had a reason the kinswomen were not to be trusted. Their ages. Even Kirstian claimed to be older than any living Aes Sedai, while Rihanna was over 100 years more than that, and not even the oldest of the kin. Her title of eldest went to the oldest of them in Ebudar, and the rigid schedule they followed to avoid notice had a number of still older women off in other places. It was obviously impossible, Saritha maintained. Elaine did not shout. She very carefully did not shout. "We will learn the truth eventually," she told Saritha. She did not doubt the kinswomen's word, but there had to be a reason why the kinswomen looked neither ageless nor anything near the ages they claimed. If she could only puzzle it out. Something told her it was obvious, but nothing leaped up, said what. "Eventually," she added firmly when the brown opened her mouth again. "That will be enough, Saritha." Saritha nodded uncertainly and fell back. Not 10 minutes later, Sibella replaced her. Every time one of the kinswomen came to make her roundabout plea to be relieved of Ispan, one of the sisters came soon after to offer the same plea. All save Marililla, who still blinked whenever Elaine looked at her. Perhaps shouting did have its uses. Certainly no one else tried to be so straightforward in attacking the kin. For instance, Vandine began with discussing the sea folk and how to counter the effects of the bargain made with them, why it was necessary to counter them as much as possible. She was quite matter-of-fact, with never a word or gesture to lay any blame. Not that she needed any. The subject did that, however delicately handled. The White Tower, she said, maintained its influence in the world not by force of arms or persuasion, or even by plotting or manipulation, though those two she brushed past lightly. Rather, the White Tower controlled or influenced events to whatever extent they did, because everyone saw the tower as standing apart and above, as more even than kings or queens. That, in turn, depended on every Aes Sedai being seen that way, as mysterious and apart, different from everyone else. A different flesh. Historically, Aes Sedai who could not manage that, and there were a few, were kept out of public view as much as possible. It took Elaine a little while to realize that the thrust of the conversation had shifted away from the sea folk, and to see where it was headed. A different flesh, mysterious and apart, could not have a sack thrust over its head and be tied across a saddle. Not where anyone who was not Aes Sedai could see, anyway. In truth, the sisters would be rougher on Ispan than the knitting circle could possibly make themselves be, just not in public. The argument might have borne more weight had it come first, but as it was, Elaine sent Van Deen packing as quickly as she did anyone else, and saw her replaced by Adelius, right after Sibella was told that if none of the knitting circle could understand what Ispan was mumbling, then none of the sisters was likely to either. Mumbling. Light. The Aes Sedai took their repeated turns, and even knowing what they were up to, sometimes it was hard to see the connection at first. By the time Cariana began by telling her that those boulders really had been toes once, supposedly on a statue of some warrior queen nearly 200 feet high. Ispan stays where she is, she told Cariana coolly without waiting for more. Now, unless you really want to tell me why the Shiotans thought of putting up a statue like that. The Green said ancient records claimed it had worn little more than armor, and not a great deal of that. A queen. No? Then, if you don't mind, I'd like to talk with Avienda alone. Thank you so much. Even being curt did not stop them, of course. She was surprised they did not send Marililla's maid to take a turn. None of this would have happened had Nynaeve been where she was meant to be. At least Elaine was sure that Nynaeve could have quelled the knitting circle and the sisters both, in short order. She was a great one for quelling. The problem was that Nynaeve had glued herself tight to Lan's side before they left the first clearing. The warders scouted ahead and to both sides of their path, and sometimes to the rear, only riding back to the column long enough to report what they had seen, or give directions on how to avoid a farm or a shepherd. Birgitta ranged far, never spending more than moments with Elaine. Lan ranged farther, and where Lan went, Nynaeve went. No one's making any trouble, are they? She demanded, with a dark stare for the sea folk the first time she followed Lan back. Well, that's all right, then, she said, before Elaine had a chance to open her mouth. Spinning her round-bellied mare like a racer, she flicked the reins and galloped after Lan, holding her hat on with one hand, catching up to him just as he vanished around the flank of the hill ahead. Of course, then there really was nothing to complain about. Rihanna had made her visit and Marililla hers, and everything seemed settled. By the next time Nynaeve appeared, Elaine had suffered through a number of disguised attempts to have Ispan turned over to the sisters. Avienda had spoken to Kurin, and the Windfinders were on a slow boil. But when Elaine explained, Nynaeve simply looked around, frowning. Of course, right at that moment, everyone had to be where they belonged. The Afa-Anmir wore glares, true, but the knitting circle were all behind them, and as for the other sisters, no group of novices could have appeared more well-behaved and innocent. Elaine wanted to shriek. I'm sure you can handle everything, Elaine, Nynaeve said. You have had all that training to be a queen. This can't be anywhere near so... Drat the man, he's going again. You can handle it. And off she went, galloping that poor mare as though it were a war-horse. That was when Avienda chose to discuss how Rand seemed to like kissing the sides of her neck, and incidentally how much she had liked it. Elaine had liked that when he did it to her, too, but however used to discussing this sort of thing she had become, uncomfortably used to it, she did not want to talk about it right then. She was angry with Rand. It was unfair, but if not for him, she could have told Nynaeve to stop treating Lan like a child who might trip over his own feet and attend to her own duties. She almost wanted to blame him for the way the knitting circle was behaving too, and the other sisters, and the Windfinders. It's one of the things men are for, taking the blame, she remembered Linny saying once, and laughing while she did. They usually deserve it, even if you don't know exactly how. Not fair. Yet she wished he were there long enough for her to box his ears, just once. Long enough to kiss him, to have him kiss the sides of her neck softly. Long enough to... He will listen to advice, even when he doesn't like hearing it, she said abruptly, her face reddening. Light, for all her talk about shame, in some areas Avienda had none, and it seemed that she herself no longer had any either. But if I tried to push him, he dug in his heels even when it was plain that I was right. Was he that way with you? Avienda glanced at her and appeared to understand. Elaine was not sure whether she liked that or not. At least there was no more talk of Rand and kissing. For a while, anyway. Avienda had some knowledge of men. She had traveled with them as a maiden of the spear, fought beside them, but she had never wanted to be anything but Far Darais Mai, and there were gaps. Even with her dolls as a child, she had always played at the spears and raiding. She had never flirted, did not understand it, and she did not understand why she felt the way she did when Rand's eyes fell on her, or 100 other things Elaine had begun learning the first time she noticed a boy looking at her differently than he did at the other boys. She expected Elaine to teach her all of it, and Elaine tried. She really could talk to Avienda about anything, if only Rand had not been the example used quite so often. If he had been there, she would have boxed his ears, and kissed him, then boxed his ears again. Not a pleasant ride at all. A miserable ride. Nynaeve made several more brief visits before finally coming to announce that the Kin's farm lay just ahead, out of sight around a low, rounded hill that appeared ready to fall on its side. Brianna had been pessimistic in her estimate. The sun had not fallen nearly 2 hours' worth. We'll be there very quickly now, Nynaeve told Elaine, not seeming to notice the sullen stare Elaine gave in return. Lan, fetch Rihanna up here, please. Best if they see a familiar face right off. He whirled his horse away, and Nynaeve turned in her saddle briefly to fix the sisters with a firm eye. I don't want you frightening them now. You hold your tongues until we have a chance to explain what's what. And hide your faces. Pull up the hoods of your cloaks. Straightening without waiting for any reply, she gave a satisfied nod. There, all settled and all right. I vow, Elaine, I don't know what you were moaning so about. Everyone's doing exactly as they should, so far as I can see. Elaine ground her teeth. She wished they were in Camelin already. That was where they were heading once this was done. She had duties long overdue in Camelin. All she had to deal with there was convincing the stronger houses that the Lion Throne was hers despite her long absence. That and handling a rival claimant or two. There might not have been any had she been there when her mother vanished, when she died. But the history of Andor said there would be by now. Somehow it seemed ever so much easier than this. Chapter 4. A Quiet Place. The Kin's farm lay in a broad hollow surrounded by 3 low hills, a sprawling affair of more than a dozen large white-plastered buildings with flat roofs, gleaming in the sun. 4 great barns were built right into the slope of the highest hill, a flat-topped thing with one side that fell away in steep cliffs beyond the barns. A few tall trees that had not lost all of their leaves provided a modicum of shade in the farmyard. To the north and east, olive groves marched away and even up the sides of the hills. A sort of slow bustle enveloped the farm, with easily over 100 people in evidence despite the afternoon heat, carrying on all the everyday tasks, but none quickly. It might almost have passed for a small village instead of a farm, except that there was not a man or a child to be seen. Elaine did not expect any. This was a waypoint for kinswomen passing through Ebu Dar to elsewhere, so there would not be too many in the city itself at one time. But that was a secret matter, as secret as the kin themselves. Publicly, this farm was known for 200 miles or more as a retreat for women, a place for contemplation and escape from the cares of the world for a time, a few days, a week, sometimes longer. Elaine could almost feel serenity in the air. She might have regretted bringing the world into this quiet place, except that she also brought new hope. The first appearance of the horses coming around the leaning hill produced far less stir than she expected. A number of the women stopped to watch, but no more than that. Their clothing varied widely. Elaine even saw a sheen of silk here and there, but some carried baskets and others buckets, or great white bundles of what had to be washed. One held a pair of bound ducks by the feet in either hand. Noblewoman and craftswoman, farmer and beggar, all were equally welcome here, but everyone did a share of the work during her stay. Avienda touched Elaine's arm, then pointed to the top of one of the hills, a thing like an inverted funnel skewed to one side. Elaine added a hand to the shade of her hat, and after a moment saw movement. Small wonder no one was surprised. Lookouts up there could see anyone coming from a long way. A middling woman walked out to meet them short of the farm buildings. Her dress was in the Ebudari style, with a deep, narrow neckline, but her dark skirts and brightly colored petticoats were short enough that she did not need to hold them up out of the dust. She did not wear a marriage knife. The kin's rules prohibited marriage. The kin had too many secrets to keep. "That's Elise," Rihanna murmured, reining in between Nynaeve and Elaine. "She runs the farm this turn. She's very intelligent." Almost like an afterthought, she added, even more quietly, "Elise does not suffer fools gladly." As Elise approached, Rihanna drew herself up in her saddle, squaring her shoulders as though for an ordeal. Middling was exactly how Elaine thought of Elise, not someone to give Rihanna pause, certainly, even had she not been the eldest of the knitting circle. Straight-backed, Elise appeared to be somewhere in her middle years, neither slender nor stout, tall nor short, a little gray, flecking dark brown hair that was tied back with a piece of ribbon, but in a very practical manner. Her face was unremarkable, though pleasant enough, a mild face, perhaps a little long in the jaw. When she saw Rihanna, she gave a fleeting look of surprise, then smiled. That smile transformed everything. It did not make her beautiful or even pretty, but Elaine felt warmed by it, comforted. "I hardly expected to see you, Rihanna," Elise said, barely hesitating over the name. Obviously, she was unsure whether to use Rihanna's rightful title in front of Nynaeve and Elaine and Avienda. She studied them with quick glances as she spoke. There seemed to be a bit of Tarabon in her voice. "Barrowin brought word of trouble in the city, of course, but I didn't think it was so bad you would have to leave. Who are all these—" Her words trailed off, and her eyes widened, staring beyond them. Elaine glanced back, nearly loosing a few of the choice phrases she had picked up in various places, most recently from Matt Cawthon. She did not understand all of them. Not most of them, really. Nobody ever wanted to explain what they meant exactly, but they did have a way of relieving emotion. The warders had doffed their color-shifting cloaks, and the sisters had drawn up the hoods of their dust cloaks as instructed. Even Saritha, who had no need to hide her youthful face, but Kariana had not pulled hers forward far enough. It simply framed her ageless features. Not everyone would know what they were seeing, yet anyone who had been in the tower surely would. Kariana jerked the hood forward at Elaine's glare, but the damage was done. Others at the farm beside Elise possessed sharp eyes. "Aes Sedai!" a woman howled, in tones suitable for announcing the end of the world. Perhaps she was, for her world. Shrieks spread like dust blown on the wind, and that quickly the farm became a kicked anthill. Here and there a woman simply fainted dead away, but most ran wildly, screaming, dropping what they carried, bumping into one another, falling down and scrambling up to run on. Flapping ducks and chickens and short-horned black goats darted wildly to avoid being trampled. In the midst of it all, some women stood gaping, plainly those who had come to the retreat with no knowledge of the kin, though a few of them began to move hurriedly too, caught up in the frenzy. "Light!" Nynaeve barked, yanking her braid. "Some of them are running into the olive groves. Stop them. The last thing we want is a panic. Send the warders. Quick! Quick!" Lan raised a questioning eyebrow, but she waved a peremptory hand at him. "Quick! Before they all run away!" With a nod that seemed to begin as a shake of his head, he sent Mandarb galloping after the other men, curving to avoid the spreading pandemonium among the buildings. Elaine shrugged at Brigitte, then motioned her to follow. She agreed with Lan. It seemed a bit late to try stopping a panic, and warders on horseback attempting to herd frightened women probably was not the best way, but she could not see how to change matters now, and there was no point letting them run off into the countryside. They would all want to hear the news she and Nynaeve brought. Elise gave no sign of running or even fidgeting. Her face paled slightly, but she stared up at Rihanna with a steady gaze. A firm gaze. "Why?" she breathed. "Why, Rihanna? I could not have imagined you doing this. Did they give you bribes? Offer immunity? Will they let you walk free while we pay the price? They probably won't allow it, but I vow I'll ask them to let me call you down. Yes, you! The rules apply even to you, eldest. If I can find a way to manage it, I vow you won't walk away from this smiling." A very firm gaze. Steely, in fact. "It isn't what you think," Rihanna said hurriedly, dismounting and dropping her reins. She caught both of Elise's hands in hers, despite the other woman's efforts to free them. "Oh, I did not want it to be like this. They know, Elise, about the kin. The tower has always known. Everything. Almost everything. But that isn't what is important." Elise's eyebrows tried to climb onto her scalp at that, but Rihanna rushed on, beaming eagerly from under her large straw hat. "We can go back, Elise. We can try again. They said we can." The farm buildings seemed to be emptying as well, women rushing out to learn what the commotion was, then joining the flight without a pause for more than hiking skirts. Shouts from the olive groves said the warders were at work, but not how much they were achieving. Perhaps not a great deal. Elaine sensed growing frustration from Brigitte and irritation. Rihanna eyed the turmoil and sighed. "We must gather them in, Elise. We can go back." "That's all very well for you and some of the others," Elise said doubtfully, "if it's true. What about the rest of us? The tower would not have let me stay as long as I did had I been quicker to learn." She darted a frown at the now well-hooded sisters, and the stare she returned to Rihanna held no little anger. "What would we go back for? To be told again we aren't strong enough and be sent on our way? Or will they just keep us as novices the rest of our lives? Some might accept that, but I won't. What for, Rihanna? What for?" Nynaeve climbed down, tugging her mare forward at the end of her reins, and Elaine imitated her, though leading Linus more easily. "To be part of the tower, if that's what you wish," Nynaeve said impatiently, before even reaching the two kinswomen. "Maybe to be Aes Sedai. Myself, I don't know why you have to be a certain strength if you can pass the fool tests. Or don't go back. Run away, for all I care. Once I'm done here, anyway." Planting her feet, she pulled off her hat and planted her fists on her hips. "This is wasting time, Rihanna, and we have work to do. Are you sure there's anybody here we can use? Speak up. If you're not sure, then we might as well get on with it. The hurry might be out of the way, but now we have the thing, I'd as soon it was over and done with." When she and Elaine were introduced as Aes Sedai, the Aes Sedai who had given the promises, Elise made a choked sound and began smoothing her woolen skirts as though her hands wanted to latch onto Rihanna's throat. Her mouth opened angrily, then snapped shut without a sound when Marililla joined them. That stern gaze did not fade completely, but it became mixed with a touch of wonder, and more than a touch of wariness. "Nynaeve Sedai," Marililla said calmly. "The Atha Annier are impatient to be off their horses. I think some may ask for healing. A brief smile flickered across her lips. That settled that question, though Nynaeve grumbled extravagantly about what she was going to do to the next person who doubted her. Elaine might have said a few choice words herself, but the truth was, Nynaeve looked more than a little silly carrying on that way, with Merlilla and Rihanna both waiting attentively for her to finish, and Elise staring at all three. That settled it. Or perhaps it was the Windfinders, afoot and pulling their horses behind them. Every shred of grace had vanished during the ride, worn away by hard saddles. Their legs seemed as stiff as their faces, yet no one could mistake them for anything but who they were. If there are 20 sea folk this far from the sea, Elise muttered, I'll believe anything. Nynaeve snorted but said nothing, for which Elaine was grateful. The woman seemed to be having a hard enough time accepting, even with Marillilla naming them Aes Sedai. Neither tirade nor tantrum would help. Then heal them, Nynaeve told Marillilla. Their eyes went to the hobbling women together, and Nynaeve added, if they ask, politely. Marillilla smiled again, but Nynaeve had already abandoned the sea folk and gone back to frowning at the now all but empty farm. A few goats still trotted around the farmyard littered with dropped wash and rakes and brooms, spilled buckets and baskets, not to mention the crumpled forms of kinswomen who had fainted, and a handful of chickens had gone back to scratching and pecking. But the only conscious women still in sight among the farm buildings were plainly not of the kin. Some wore embroidered linen or silk, and some rough country woolens, yet the fact that they had not run spoke that much of them. Rihanna said that at any given time as many as half those at the farm might fall into that group. Most appeared stunned. Despite her grumbling, Nynaeve wasted no time taking charge of Elise. Or perhaps Elise took charge of Nynaeve. It was difficult to tell, since the kinswoman showed little of the deference toward Aes Sedai that the knitting circle did. Perhaps she was still just too numbed by the sudden turn of events. In any case, they moved off together, Nynaeve leading her mare and gesturing with the hat in her other hand, instructing Elise on how to bring in the scattered women and what to do with them once they were collected. Rihanna had been sure that at least one woman strong enough to join the circle was there, Garinia Rosoinda, and possibly two more. In truth, Elaine was hoping they had all gone. Elise alternated between nodding and giving Nynaeve very level looks that Nynaeve seemed not to notice. Now, in the wait while the gathering was done, seemed a good time to do a bit more searching through the panniers. But when Elaine turned toward the pack horses, which were just beginning to be led toward the farm buildings, she noticed the knitting circle, Rihanna and the whole lot of them, making their own way into the farm on foot, some hurrying toward women lying on the ground, others toward those standing about gaping. The whole lot of them, and no sign of Ispan. It took only a glance to find her, though. Between Adelius and Van Deen, each holding an arm as they half-dragged her along, their dust cloaks streaming behind. The white-haired sisters were linked, the glow of Saidar somehow encompassing them both without including Ispan. There was no way to tell which led the small circle and held the shield on the dark friend, but not even one of the Forsaken could have broken it. They stopped to speak to a stout woman in plain brown wool who gaped at the leather sack covering Ispan's head, but still curtsied and pointed toward one of the white-plastered buildings. Elaine exchanged angry glances with Avienda. Well, hers was angry anyway. Sometimes Avienda gave away no more than a stone. Handing their horses over to two of the palace stablemen, they hurried after the three. Some of the women who were not of the kin tried to question them about what was happening, a few in rather overbearing fashion, but Elaine gave them short shrift, leaving behind a wake of indignant sniffs and snorts. Oh, what she would not give to have the ageless face already. That tweaked a thread in the back of her thoughts, but it vanished as soon as she tried to examine it. When she pushed open the plain wooden door where the trio had vanished, Adelius and Van Deen had Ispan seated in a ladder-back chair with her head bare, the sack lying atop a narrow trestle table with their linen cloaks. The room possessed only one window, set in the ceiling, but with the sun still high, it let in a good light. Shelves lined the walls, stacked with large copper pots and big white bowls. By the smell of bread baking, the only other door led into a kitchen. Van Deen looked around sharply at the sound of the door, but seeing them, she smoothed her face to a total lack of expression. Sumiko said the herbs Nynaeve gave her were wearing off, she said, and it seemed best to question her a little before fuzzing her brain again. We do seem to have time now. It would be good to know what the Black Aja, her mouth twisted in distaste, was up to in Ebudar, and what they know. I doubt they are aware of this farm, since we were not, Adelius said, tapping a finger thoughtfully on her lips as she studied the woman in the chair. But it is better to be sure than to weep later, as our father used to say. She might have been examining an animal she had never seen before, a creature she could not fathom existing. Ispan's lip curled. Sweat rolled down her bruised face, and her dark beaded braids were disheveled, and her clothing all disarrayed. But despite bleary eyes, she was not nearly so woozy as she had been. The Black Aja, it is a fable and a filthy one, she sneered, a trifle hoarsely. It must have been very hot inside that leather sack, and she had had no water since leaving the Tarasin palace. Me, I am surprised that you will give it voice, and to cast the charge on me. What I have done on the orders of the Amerlin seat. Elida? Elaine spat incredulously. You have the nerve to claim that Elida ordered you to murder sisters and steal from the tower? Elida ordered what you did in Tyr and Tanchico? Or do you mean Swan? Your lies are pathetic. You've forsaken the 3 oaths somehow, and that names you Black Aja. I do not have to answer the questions from you, Ispan said sullenly, hunching her shoulders. You are rebels against the lawful Amerlin seat. You will be punished, perhaps stilled, especially if you harm me. I serve the true Amerlin seat, and you will be punished severely if you harm me. You will answer any questions my near sister asks. Avienda tested her belt knife on a thumbnail, but her eyes were on Ispan's. Wetlanders feel pain. They do not know how to embrace it, accept it. You will answer as you are asked. She did not glare or snarl. She just spoke, but Ispan shrank back in the chair. I fear that is prescribed, even were she not an initiate of the tower, Adelius said. We are forbidden to shed blood in questioning, or to allow others to do so in our name. She sounded reluctant, though whether over the prohibition or over admitting that Ispan was an initiate, Elaine could not say. She herself had not really considered that Ispan might still be considered one. There was a saying that no woman was finished with the tower until it was finished with her, but truthfully, once the White Tower touched you, it never was finished. Her brow furrowed as she studied the Black Sister, so bedraggled and still so sure of herself. Ispan sat up a little straighter and darted glances full of amused contempt at Avienda and Elaine. She had not been so poised earlier when she thought it was Nynaeve and Elaine alone who had her. Regained composure had come with remembering that there were older sisters present. Sisters who would hold White Tower law as part of themselves. That law forbade not only shedding blood, but breaking bones and a number of other things that any White Cloak questioner would be more than ready to do. Before any session began, healing had to be given, and if the questioning started after sunrise, it had to end before sundown. If after sunset, then before sunrise. The law was even more restrictive when it came to initiates of the tower, the sisters and accepted and novices, banning the use of Saidar in questioning, punishment, or penance. Oh, a sister might flick a novice's ear with the power if she was exasperated, or even give her a swat on the bottom, but not very much more. Ispan smiled at her. Smiled? Elaine took a deep breath. Adelius, Van Deen, I want you to leave Avienda and me alone with Ispan. Her stomach tried to tie itself into a knot. There had to be a way to press the woman sufficiently to learn what was needed without breaking tower law. But how? People who were to be questioned by the tower usually began talking before a finger was laid on them. Everyone knew that no one held out against the tower. No one. But they were very seldom initiates. She could hear another voice, not Lini's this time, but her mother's. What you order done, you must be willing to do with your own hands. As a queen, what you order done, you have done. If she did break the law, her mother's voice again, even a queen cannot be above the law, or there is no law. And Lini's, you can do whatever you wish, child, so long as you're willing to pay the price. She dragged her hat off without untying the ribbons. Keeping her voice steady took an effort. When we are done talking with her, you can take her back to the knitting circle. Afterward, she would submit herself to Marililla. Any 5 sisters could sit in judgment to set a penance, if they were asked. Ispan's head swung, swollen eyes going from Elaine to Avienda and back, slowly widening until the whites showed all the way around. She was not so sure of herself now. Silent glances passed between Van Deen and Adelius, in the manner of people who had spent so much time together they hardly needed to speak aloud any longer. Then Van Deen took Elaine and Avienda each by an arm. "If I may speak with you outside a moment," she murmured. It sounded a suggestion, but she was already urging them to the door. Outside in the farmyard, perhaps 2 dozen or so kinswomen were huddled together like sheep. Not all wore Ebudari clothes, but 2 had the red belts of wise women, and Elaine recognized Berowyn, a stout little woman who normally showed a pride far greater than her strength in the power. Not now. Like the rest, her face was frightened, her eyes darting, despite the entire knitting circle surrounding them and talking urgently. Down the way, Nynaeve and Elise were trying to herd perhaps twice as many women inside one of the larger buildings. Trying did seem to be the word. "Don't care what estates you hold," Nynaeve was shouting at a proud-necked woman in pale green silk. "You get in there and stay in there out of the way, or I'll kick you inside." Elise simply seized the green-clad woman by the scruff of the neck and ran her through the doorway despite voluble and heated protests. There was a loud squawk like a huge goose being stepped on. Then Elise reappeared, dusting her hands. The others seemed to give no trouble after that. Van Deen released them, studying their eyes. The glow still enveloped her, yet Adelius must have been focusing their combined flows. Van Deen could have maintained the shield, once woven, without being able to see it, but had she been the one, it was much likelier that Adelius would have brought them out. Van Deen could have gone several hundred paces before the link began to attenuate. It would not break if she and Adelius went to opposite corners of the earth, though it would have been useless long before that. But she remained close to the door. She seemed to sort words in her head. "I've always thought it best if women with experience handle this sort of thing," she said finally. "The young can easily be caught up in hot blood. Then they do too much. Or sometimes they realize they can't bring themselves to do enough because they haven't really seen enough yet. Or worst of all, they find a taste for it. Not that I believe either of you has that flaw." She gave Avienda a weighing glance without pausing. Avienda hastily sheathed her belt knife. "Adelius and I have seen enough to know why we must do what must be done, and we left hot blood behind long ago. Perhaps you will leave this to us. Much better that way, all around." Van Deen seemed to take the recommendation as accepted. She nodded and turned back toward the door. No sooner had she disappeared behind it than Elaine felt the use of the power within, a weave that must have blanketed the room inside. A ward against eavesdropping, certainly. They would not want stray ears to catch whatever Ispan said. Then another use hit her, and suddenly the silence from within was more ominous than any shrieks that ward would contain. She crushed her hat back onto her head. The heat she could not feel, but the sun's glare suddenly made her queasy. "Maybe you'll help me look over what the pack horses are carrying," she said breathily. She had not ordered it done, whatever it was, but that did not seem to change anything. Avienda nodded with surprising quickness. She seemed to want to be away from that silence, too. The windfinders were waiting not far from where the servants had the pack animals, waiting impatiently and staring about imperiously, arms folded beneath their breasts, copying Renila. Elise marched up to them, marking Renila out as the leader after one sweeping glance. Elaine and Avienda she ignored. "Come with me," she said in brisk tones that brooked no argument. "The Aes Sedai say you will want to be out of the sun until matters are more settled." The words Aes Sedai held as much bitterness as they did the awe Elaine was used to from kinswomen, maybe more. Renila stiffened, her dark face growing darker, but Elise plowed on. "You Wilders can sit out here and sweat if that's what you want for all of me. If you can sit." It was obvious none of the Athan Nier had received healing for their saddle soreness. They stood like women who wanted to forget they existed, below the waist. "What you will not do is keep me waiting." "Do you know who I am?" Renila demanded in a tight fury, but Elise was already walking away and not looking back. Struggling with herself visibly, Renila dashed sweat from her forehead with the back of her hand, then angrily ordered the other windfinders to leave the shore-cursed horses and follow her. They made a spraddle-legged line, wobbling along after Elise, everyone but the two apprentices muttering to herself, Elise included. Instinctively, Elaine began to plan how to smooth matters over, how to get the Athaan Mier's pains healed without them having to ask, or a sister having to offer too strenuously. Nynaeve had to be appeased, too, and the other sisters. To her surprise, she suddenly realized that for once in her life she had no real desire to smooth anything. Watching the windfinders limp toward one of the farm buildings, she decided that matters were fine just as they were. Avienda wore a large open grin as she watched the Athaan Mier. Elaine snatched the much smaller smile from her own face and turned to the pack horses. They did deserve it, though. Not grinning was very hard. With Avienda's help, the searching went more quickly than before, though Avienda did not recognize what they were after as quickly as she did. Not a great surprise. A few of the sisters Elaine had trained showed a greater skill in this than she did herself, but most came nowhere near. Still, 2 sets of hands found more than one, and there was a great deal to be found. Liveried stablemen and women carried away the rubbish, while a collection of turangrial grew on the broad stone lid of a square cistern. 4 more horses were unloaded quickly, and they accumulated a selection that would have caused a celebration brought into the tower, even with no one studying turangrial. They took every form imaginable. Cups and bowls and vases, no two the same size or design or in the same material. A flat, worm-eaten box, half falling apart, and whatever had lined it long since gone to dust, held pieces of jewelry. A necklace and bracelets set with colored stones, a slim gem-studded belt, several finger rings, and there were spaces for more. Every single one was a turangrial, and they all matched, meant to be worn together, though Elaine could not imagine why any woman would want to carry so many about her at one time. Avienda found a dagger with gold wire wrapped around the hilt of rough deer horn. The blade was dull, and by all evidence always had been. She kept turning that over and over in her fingers. Her hands actually began to tremble, until Elaine took it away from her and put it with the others on the cistern's lid. Even then, Avienda stood for a time, looking at it and licking her lips as though they had gone dry. There were finger rings, earrings, necklaces, bracelets, and buckles, many of very peculiar pattern indeed. There were statuettes and figures of birds and animals and people, several knives that did have edges, half a dozen large medallions in bronze or steel, most worked with strange patterns, and not one carrying an image Elaine could really understand. A pair of peculiar hats, seemingly made of metal, too ornate and too thin to be helmets, and any number of items she could not think what to call. A rod as thick as her wrist, bright red and smooth and rounded, firm rather than hard, for all that it seemed to be stone. It did not warm slightly in her hand, it almost felt hot. Not real heat any more than the warmth was real, but still. What about a set of metal basketwork balls, one inside the other? Any movement produced a faint musical chime, a different tone every time, and she had the feeling that no matter how hard she looked into it, there would always be a still smaller ball waiting to be discovered. A thing that looked like a blacksmith's puzzle made of glass. It was heavy enough that she dropped it, and it broke a chip off the edge of the cistern cover. A collection to stir amazement in any Aes Sedai. More important, they found two more Angreal. Those Elaine set very carefully aside within arm's reach. One was an odd piece of jewelry, a golden bracelet attached by 4 flat chains to finger rings, every bit of it engraved in an intricate maze-like pattern. That was the stronger of the two, stronger than the turtle still in her pouch. It was made for a smaller hand than hers or Avienda's. Strangely, the bracelet had a tiny lock, complete with a minuscule tubular key dangling from a fine chain that was obviously made to be removed, along with the key. The other was a seated woman in age-darkened ivory, her legs folded in front of her exposed knees bare, but with hair so long and luxuriant she could not have been more muffled in the heaviest cloak. It was not even as strong as the turtle, but she found it very appealing. One hand rested on a knee, palm up and fingers arranged so the thumb touched the tips of the middle 2 fingers, while the other hand was lifted, the first 2 fingers raised and the others folded. The whole figure carried an air of supreme dignity, yet the delicately worked face showed amusement and delight. Maybe it had been made for a particular woman. It seemed personal somehow. Perhaps they had done that in the age of legends. Some Terangreal were immense, needing men and horses or even the power to move, but most Angreal were small enough to carry about your person. Not all, but most. They were tossing back the canvas covers on another set of wicker panniers when Nynaeve came striding up. The Athaan Mier began filing out of one of the farm buildings, no longer limping. Marililla was talking with Ranila, or rather the Windfinder was talking and Marililla listening. Elaine wondered what had happened in there. The slim gray did not look so satisfied any more. The huddle of kinswomen had grown larger, but even as Elaine looked up, 3 more came hesitantly into the farmyard, and another 2 stood at the edge of the olive trees, peering about indecisively. She could sense Brigitte somewhere out among the groves, and only a little less irritated than earlier. Nynaeve glanced at the display of Terangreal and gave her braid a tug. Her hat had gone missing somewhere. "That can wait," she said, sounding disgusted. "It's time." Chapter 5. The Breaking Storm. The sun stood little more than halfway down toward the horizon by the time they clambered up the well-worn, snaking path to the top of the steep-sided hill above the barns. That was the spot Ranila had chosen. It did make sense from what Elaine knew of working weather, all learned from a seafolk windfinder, to be sure. Changing anything beyond your immediate vicinity required working over long distances, which meant being able to see a long distance, much easier on the ocean than on land, except from a mountain or hilltop. It also needed a deft hand to avoid causing torrential rains or whirlwinds, or the light alone knew what elsewhere. Whatever you did, the effects spread like ripples from a stone tossed into a pond. She had no desire whatsoever to leave the circle that would use the bowl. The top of the hill was clear of brush and flat, if far from level.
All right, everyone, I'm going to call into this live for tonight. Well, I want to thank everyone for stopping by and everyone who keeps stopping by. I appreciate all y'all's support. Until next time, everyone, y'all stay safe.